So General Motors just shut down every one of its remaining manufacturing operations in Canada, not scaled back, not restructured, not transitioned to a reduced footprint, while the trade environment stabilizes, shut down every assembly plant, every parts facility, every engineering center. The Oshawa Assembly Complex, one of the most productive auto plants in North America, a facility that has been building vehicles for nearly a century, the economic heartbeat of an entire city, the St. Catharines Powertrain Facility, the Markham Technical Center, the Woodstock Parks operation, all of it closed. 11,000 workers told their jobs are gone, not because they failed, not because the plants were unprofitable, not because they built a bad product, but because a foreign government told their employer to leave. And the announcement came wrapped in corporate language about strategic portfolio optimization and global capacity realignment, language designed with the precision of a legal department that has done this before to make the destruction of 11,000 livelihoods sound like an accounting adjustment. Ottawa didn't beg to stay. Ottawa didn't offer a penny in subsidies. Ottawa didn't negotiate. Within 72 hours, Mark Carney announced the Canadian Automotive Sovereignty Initiative, a $12 billion plan to replace every job GM eliminated with something GM never anticipated, a Canadian-owned, globally partnered electric vehicle and advanced manufacturing ecosystem built on the exact factory sites GM is abandoning. European, Japanese, and South Korean automakers have already committed to production partnerships. Every displaced GM worker has been guaranteed priority placement, fully funded retraining, and wage protection during the transition. And one provision in the initiative, a regulatory measure targeting critical battery mineral exports, just put a chokehold on GM's own electric vehicle supply chain that the company's board of directors reportedly called the most aggressive regulatory action a government has ever taken against a departing manufacturer. Warren Buffett said GM just made the most expensive exit in corporate history, not because of what it lost in Canada, but because of what Canada took from it on the way out. And then he explained why abandoning a country that controls your supply chain is the one business decision that cannot be survived. But the line that every displaced auto worker in Ontario is repeating tonight, the line Carney delivered standing on the floor of the shuttered GM assembly plant in Oshawa, surrounded by workers who had just lost their livelihoods, some still wearing their uniforms, some holding their ID badges, some holding their children, is 11 words that turned a corporate shutdown into a national declaration of intent. They closed a factory. We're going to build an industry. When you understand the real reason GM left Canada, the human cost, the corporate press release was designed to hide, what the $12 billion initiative actually builds, how the mineral provision just crippled GM's electric vehicle future, what Buffett said about the one mistake a company doesn't recover from, and why this shutdown will cost GM more than it will ever cost Canada, you'll understand why this isn't a plant closure. It's the beginning of the end of GM's competitive position in the electric vehicle market. And GM did it to itself. Hit subscribe because this is about to reshape the North American auto industry permanently. Let me take you through exactly what GM announced, because the scale of the shutdown and the language they used to justify it tells you everything about what this actually was. GM's public statement described the closures as part of a global portfolio optimization to align production capacity with evolving market demand and strategic manufacturing priorities. Portfolio optimization, capacity alignment, strategic priorities, every word chosen by lawyers and communications professionals to make a political decision sound like a business one. The Oshawa Assembly Complex, a facility that at its peak employed over 20,000 workers, that has been building vehicles since 1953, that is woven into the identity of the city, the way a cathedral is woven into a medieval town, shut down. The St. Catharines Powertrain plant, one of the most advanced engine and transmission facilities in the GM system, a plant that won internal quality awards year after year, shut down. Engineering centers, parts operations, logistics hubs shut down, 11,000 direct jobs eliminated. And the timing announced during the most intense period of the US-Canada trade war. During the same month, the White House escalated tariff threats to their highest level was not coincidental. The timing tells the story. The press release was designed to hide. GM's history in Canada stretches back nearly a century. Communities grew up around these plants. Oshawa, St. Catharines, towns where GM wasn't just the biggest employer, it was the foundation. The restaurants where plant workers ate lunch, the daycare's time to shift schedules, the real estate market sustained by GM wages, the school budgets funded by GM property taxes, the small businesses on the main street that existed because the plant existed. 3 generations of families built their economic lives around GM employment. Grandparents who started on the line, parents who worked their way into skilled trades, children who grew up assuming the same path would be there for them. And there is one detail that makes the shutdown not just economically devastating, but morally obscene. In 2008 and 2009, when General Motors was on the verge of total collapse, when the company was dazed from liquidation, when every analyst on Wall Street had written it off, when the American auto industry was staring into an abyss, Canadian taxpayers helped save GM. The Canadian government committed billions in emergency support. Canadian workers kept the plants running through the uncertainty. Canadian communities absorbed the fear and the instability and the not knowing. They saved the company. And now, 17 years later, the company they saved closed the door on the way out and called it optimization. And behind the numbers, behind the 11,000 in the corporate language and the quarterly earnings projections, there are people, and the human cost of what GM just did is the part the spreadsheets will never show. A line worker in Oshawa, 53 years old, 31 years on the assembly floor, started 3 weeks after his father retired from the same plant. His pension is 16 months short of full vesting, too old to retrain easily for a new industry, too young to retire. His mortgage has 11 years left. His daughter starts university in September. A young couple in St. Catharines who bought their first house 8 months ago qualified for the mortgage on 2 GM incomes. One assembler, one quality inspector, both notified on the same day. A single mother working the second shift because the plant's daycare ran until 11 o'clock at night. A benefit negotiated by the union 2 decades ago for exactly her situation. The plant closes and the daycare closes with it, and the shift work that paid the bills and the childcare that made the shift work possible disappear on the same afternoon. A small business owner who runs a diner 400 meters from the Oshawa plant's main gate. She's done the math. 60% of her weekday revenue comes from plant workers. She has 3 employees. She gives them a month. Every direct job at a major auto plant supports an estimated 3 to 4 jobs in the surrounding economy. Part suppliers, logistics companies, maintenance contractors, retail, healthcare, housing. 11,000 direct job losses means 30 to 40,000 families affected. The parking lot at the Oshawa plant the morning after the announcement, empty. The shift horn that should have sounded at 6 a.m., silent. The break room where 1,000 conversations happened every day, locked. The lunchroom bulletin board still showing the schedule for next week's shifts that will never run. There is a specific silence that fills a factory town when the factory goes quiet. It is not the silence of peace, it is the silence of something that was alive and isn't anymore. And 11,000 families are living in that silence tonight. And the reason, the real reason, not the press release reason, is worse than the shutdown itself, because GM didn't leave Canada because it made business sense. GM left Canada because it was told to. Reports emerged within days, sourced to internal GM communications and confirmed by 4 officials familiar with the White House's manufacturing strategy, that the administration communicated to American auto manufacturers that maintaining significant production in Canada during the trade war would be viewed as inconsistent with American economic priorities and would affect their standing with the administration on regulatory approvals, government contracts, and access to federal EV manufacturing incentives. The EV subsidy lever was the sharpest tool. Billions of dollars in American electric vehicle tax credits, battery manufacturing grants, and clean energy infrastructure funding. The financial architecture of GM's entire electric future were implicitly linked to production geography. Companies that reshorted from Canada to the United States would receive full access. Companies that maintain large Canadian footprints would face enhanced review, bureaucratic language for delays, complications, and quiet debt prioritization. It's in a funding pipeline worth tens of billions. Leaked internal communications laid it bare. GM executives communicated to division heads that the Canadian closures were driven by the current trade policy environment and the administration's expectations regarding production geography. Production geography, not production quality, not production cost, not production efficiency. Geography where the plant sits on a map. A senior GM executive reportedly told board members that the Canadian operations were profitable, productive, and among the highest quality facilities in our global network, but that maintaining them creates political exposure that exceeds the operational benefit in the current environment. Profitable, productive, highest quality, closed anyway. Not because the plants failed, because a government, not even their own government, told their employer that the political cost of staying was higher than the economic value of the work. 11,000 workers lost their jobs, not to competition, not to automation, not to market failure, but to a political calculation made in a building they've never been inside, in a city 1,000 kilometers away, by people who will never know their names. And then Ottawa responded, and the response was not what GM expected. It was not what the White House expected. And it was not what anyone watching the North American auto industry expected, because Ottawa didn't offer a single dollar to keep GM on Canadian soil. Ottawa replaced GM. The Canadian Automotive Sovereignty Initiative, $12 billion in public investment and committed private partnership capital, was announced within 72 hours of the shutdown, and its structure communicated a philosophy that was more devastating to GM than any tariff or sanction could have been. We will not subsidize a company to stay in a country it was ordered to leave. Subsidies create dependency. We are done with dependency. We are building sovereignty. The first component was new manufacturing partnerships, and the speed at which they materialized stunned the industry. Volkswagen Group committed to a new EV assembly facility in Oshawa on the GM site, using a portion of the existing infrastructure, hiring from the same labor pool. Toyota expanded its existing Canadian operations and committed to a new battery component plant in southern Ontario. Hyundai Kia signed a letter of intent for a Canadian assembly facility focused on electric crossovers for the North American and European markets. Honda accelerated expansion of its Alliston operations. BMW entered preliminary agreements for a component manufacturing partnership. The strategy was deliberate and pointed. The exact communities GM abandoned would host the production lines of GM's competitors, the same workers, the same towns, the same parking lots, different name on the building. The message to GM was implicit but unmistakable. You left a vacuum and we filled it before the dust settled. The second component was a Canadian-owned EV ecosystem, not just foreign assembly but domestic technology. A government-backed national EV battery gigafactory, the first fully Canadian-owned large-scale battery manufacturing facility projected to employ over 3,000 workers, research and development hubs for battery chemistry, autonomous driving systems, EV powertrain engineering, and advanced manufacturing robotics. The long-term vision was not just to build cars in Canada for foreign companies, but to build Canadian automotive technology, intellectual property, patents, engineering capability that would make Canada a creator, not just an assembler. The third component was the worker transition program, and this was where the initiative's moral weight was heaviest. Every displaced GM worker was offered priority placement in new facilities first in line before any external hiring. Fully funded retraining programs for workers transitioning from internal combustion engine manufacturing to EV and advanced manufacturing. Programs designed in consultation with the incoming manufacturers to ensure the skills match the jobs, wage protection guarantees during the transition period. No worker would take a pay cut while retraining, pension and benefits bridging for workers within 5 years of retirement, ensuring that the 16 months of pension vesting the 53-year-old in Oshawa was about to lose would be covered. The commitment was specific and binding. No GM worker will be abandoned. No GM community will be left behind. No family will fall through the gap between the company that left and the industry that's arriving. The fourth component was supply chain restructuring, redirecting the hundreds of Canadian auto parts manufacturers, tooling companies, and logistics firms that had supplied GM toward the new partners. Government contracts, retooling loans, and transition grants ensured that the small and medium businesses that formed GM's Canadian supply ecosystem would become Toyota's supply ecosystem, Volkswagen's supply ecosystem, Hyundai's supply ecosystem. The industrial fabric of southern Ontario wouldn't be torn apart, it would be rewoven. And then one provision, the provision that transformed the initiative from a defensive rebuilding program into an offensive strategic weapon, became public. And that's when GM's board realized that the shutdown hadn't just cost them Canadian workers, it had cost them their future. Canada implemented a critical mineral export responsibility framework, a regulatory structure that conditions the export of Canadian nickel, cobalt, lithium, and other battery essential minerals on the purchasing manufacturer's commitment to maintaining Canadian production and employment. The framework is universal in language and surgical in effect. Manufacturers with active Canadian production facilities receive priority mineral export access at standard market terms, full allocation, market pricing, streamlined approvals. Manufacturers that have closed Canadian facilities or withdrawn Canadian production face export restrictions, premium pricing surcharges of up to 30%, and reduced allocation quotas for Canadian origin battery minerals. The framework doesn't name GM, it doesn't need to. GM just closed every facility it operated in Canada. GM now falls automatically and by its own actions into the restricted category. The implications for GM's electric vehicle strategy are catastrophic. GM's entire EV roadmap, the Altium platform, the next generation of electric trucks, SUVs, and sedans, the billions already invested in battery technology and gigafactory capacity depends on securing stable, long-term, competitively priced supply of battery minerals. Canada controls massive reserves of exactly the minerals GM needs: nickel, cobalt, lithium, rare earth elements. GM's EV future runs on Canadian rock, and Canadian rock just got 30% more expensive for GM and 30% cheaper relatively for every competitor that had the strategic sense to stay. The competitive knife is precise. Toyota is building in Canada with priority mineral access. Honda is building in Canada with priority mineral access. Hyundai, Volkswagen, BMW, all building, all receiving priority access to the exact minerals GM needs and can no longer get at competitive prices. In 5 years, those manufacturers will produce electric vehicles with structurally lower battery costs than GM can achieve, not because they are better at engineering, not because their factories are more efficient, because their mineral inputs are cheaper, and cheaper inputs compounded across millions of vehicles over a product cycle create a cost advantage that no amount of engineering brilliance can overcome. GM left Canada to avoid political risk. By leaving, it created a supply chain risk that is orders of magnitude more devastating than any regulatory friction could have been. The political risk of staying was an uncomfortable conversation with the White House. The supply chain risk of leaving is competitive extinction in the market that defines the future of the auto industry. And here is what GM's board is just now beginning to understand. Because the math, when you run it honestly, produces a result nobody in Detroit expected. The shutdown hurts GM more than it hurts Canada. Canada's loss is real. 11,000 jobs lost, economic disruption in 4 communities, short-term pain that falls on real families and real towns. None of that is minimized, but Canada's gain is structural. A diversified multi-manufacturer automotive ecosystem replacing dependency on one American company. Canadian-owned EV technology, a vertically integrated mineral on Oshawa RIP. A mineral on Oshawa replace in 5 years, those manufacturers will produce electric vehicles with structurally lower battery costs than GM can achieve, not because they are better at engineering, not because their factories are more efficient, because their mineral inputs are cheaper, and cheaper inputs compounded across millions of vehicles over a product cycle create a cost advantage that no amount of engineering brilliance can overcome. GM left Canada to avoid political risk. By leaving, it created a supply chain risk that is orders of magnitude more devastating than any regulatory friction could have been. The political risk of staying was an uncomfortable conversation with the White House. The supply chain risk of leaving is competitive extinction in the market that defines the future of the auto industry. And here is what GM's board is just now beginning to understand, because the math, when you run it honestly, produces a result nobody in Detroit expected. The shutdown hurts GM more than it hurts Canada. Canada's loss is real: 11,000 jobs lost, economic disruption in 4 communities, short-term pain that falls on real families and real towns. None of that is minimized, but Canada's gain is structural: a diversified multi-manufacturer automotive ecosystem replacing dependency on one American company. Canadian-owned EV technology, a vertically integrated mineral on a Ottawa, replacing supply chain, partnerships with 5 of the world's 10 largest automakers, worker retraining placement and wage protection, and the permanent elimination of the single manufacturer vulnerability that made the shutdown possible in the first place. Canada's pain is transitional. It has a timeline and a plan and an end date. GM's pain is structural and compounding. Every year, GM operates without priority Canadian mineral access. Its EV battery cost disadvantage grows. Every year, its former workers build vehicles for Toyota and Volkswagen and Hyundai. Those competitors, Canadian production capacity deepens and their cost advantage widens. Every year, GM remains outside the framework. The competitive landscape reshapes further around its absence. Canada's pain is measured in months of transition. GM's pain is measured in product cycles. And in the auto industry, a product cycle is a generation. The bailout irony completes the arc. In 2009, Canada helped save GM from bankruptcy. Canadian taxpayers invested billions in a company that was days from liquidation.